Greetings on behalf of the Greenbelt Recreation Arts Program. It is our honor to present this fall at the Greenbelt Community Center Art Gallery, Stories My Father Told Me, the Art of Helen Zughaib. The exhibition includes 21 paintings and prints from a series of works which Helen created based on her father's stories of his childhood in Syria and Lebanon. The period depicted is the 1930s and 40s, giving us a glimpse of village life 5,800 miles away, coinciding with Greenbelt's construction and early years. Helen's richly colored and patterned compositions portray daily domestic life, family dynamics, community rituals, and her father's immigration to the United States in 1946 aboard a storied ship named the Vulcania. Described by artist Helen Frederick as a path of radiance, the series is reproduced in the book Stories My Father Told Me, published in 2020 by Kuhn Press. Writer and curator Maimana Farhat notes, the work transports the viewer to a world of beauty and wonder, while narrating the stories of a people who survived political turmoil and uncertain times with humor, grace, and empathy, all rooted in unconditional love. Helen Zughaib, welcome, and thank you so much for sharing your beautiful artwork with us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you today. Thank you.
This series was created over a span of 12 years in response to the written stories which you received one at a time and somewhat begrudgingly from your father, Elia Zughaib. What was it like to work with him on this extended project?
Well, I love that question. And I didn't really think of it initially as working with him. Now, as you sort of referred to, it was very grudging. And with the help of my mom, who managed to convince Daddy to actually write down his stories, because, I think you and I were talking, when I first approached him, I said, Daddy, would you please write your stories for me and I'll paint them? Mm-hmm. And he just looked at me and he said no. And he walked out of the room and left me there looking at my mom. And she said, go back to your studio, dear, and we'll call you. And I will try and talk to your father. So I said, okay. And I came back to my studio. I waited for a phone call. They called me back over there. They were living next door to me at the time. And my father very grudgingly agreed to write the stories, but insisted to me that they were private and that nobody would be interested in them and that they were family and it was just not anyone's business or nobody would care about these stories. But he did agree, but it was like pulling teeth. So yes, they came out little by little by little, but yeah. Mm-hmm. And looking back now, it was working with my father and looking back, it's quite special, and I think it's rare to have had this. And had I thought about it in that large of a term, I may have been intimidated, So I feel very lucky. I feel lucky. It was kind of just life going by and working on this together, and hoping for a book at one point and hoping and a real dream come true with the book being published. I would say that I got to know him in a way maybe my sisters and my brother didn't, though the stories were told to all of us, and for his grandchildren as well. I put this in quotations, teaching, if you will, because in the Arab world, and in many parts, Turkey, Persia, it's a form of education. Actually, the storytelling, and the word is hakawati. I'm a little diverging from your question, but the word in Arabic is hakawati, which means storyteller. And in general, it is an elder of the village or an older relative or the patriarch of the family, in which case my father is, who would pass on family stories from before, so we can learn, so we can be respectful of our family and the community, to teach us about morals to teach us how to behave in society, what is valuable, what is not valuable, how we contribute to our society, how we give back to our society, whether it's squishing grapes and making molasses, and not everybody in the village could contribute to that, but everyone in the village received molasses for the year. I mean, the village life, was about generosity and sharing and compassion for your neighbor and your family and your tribe. It's very interesting. So all these stories, is another way of teaching. So in a way, my father was teaching and really living up to that other part of the education that he felt was important that we didn't receive in schooling. It's quite nice. So I think I got a special bond with him, whether or not he'd like to agree with that. Now I'm taking that as a special bond. So yeah, I love that question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
When you began this series, Helen, your artistic style that we see here was already very well developed. Can you tell us about your influences and how you cultivated your visual language?
Sure. Growing up overseas, primarily in the Middle East, I grew up with, I don't know that the word is decorative, but tiles and carpets and the light and the architecture that, I grew up, and my parents have an amazing collection of Arab art. And, you take it for granted how you grew up, but you're influenced by everything that's around you. In school, I was able to study, let's put it this way, primarily Western and European artists in terms of art history and painting and so on and so forth. So I knew about Picasso and Matisse and Van Gogh and those Mondrian. Those artists, I knew less about Arab artists. We didn't study that. Things are maybe a little bit changing, but for me, one of my earliest heroes was Matisse. And oh my goodness, his colors, his sort of stylized version, if you think about his work, pattern was very important. He also went and spent a lot of time in Tunisia, and his work was highly influenced by what he saw there. The light, the pattern, the color, things that also inspired me growing up that way. So I think these paintings are also a bit nostalgic as well, because that I was evacuated from the civil war in Lebanon, and I never got to go back until 35 years later. So much of these stories, all these stories were created well after that. So I relied on my mind and nostalgia, and the painting behind you. I had never seen a Damascene goat. I had no idea what it was, but when Daddy described with his long beards of the goat, and I was just trying to picture what that could be. So it's my invention. There are those goats, but yeah, I think so much comes into what you take inside, and then what ultimately comes out. And a little bit my style has grown, and but this series certainly is, someone will recognize, they will for sure say that is my style there. They identify me with that, which is wonderful for me. I love that. I take it as a big compliment.
Are there kind of takeaways for you from the entire project that have shaped your direction in other pieces that you're working on?
Especially since 9/11, as an Arab American, that whole genre of work, if you want to talk about it, that became moved to the forefront. Nobody really thought about it before. Nobody concentrated about it before. But all of a sudden, after 9/11, people started questioning, like, who are Arab Americans? Who are Arabs? What, out of interest, not necessarily out of a bad way to get to the, but, so I began sort of re-examining my own background as an Arab American, and really, thinking I need to learn. I need to learn more. I need to know what is valuable. I need to think about how I, as an artist, am going forward, especially living in the United States, um, what I want my legacy to be. What do I want to leave behind me? Working over the years with Daddy on this, um, I have thought about that quite a bit, and especially with the volatility in the Middle East. How events now globally affect this country's attitudes towards the Arabs. It's very important to me. I have that on my shoulder as a mantle. Whether or not I'm successful in that endeavor, I'm not so completely sure of, and I guess we won't know. But certainly, this book and issues that I'm working on now as a result of the Arab Spring and the war in Syria and the massive migration crisis and displacement. I think that is important, and so I continue to focus on that. But yeah, what great questions. These are like some of my best questions I've ever had. So thank you.
Very kind.
Yeah.
As we have this conversation today, you've alluded to the fact that we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Would you like to say any more about the significance of that for you personally and how that event and its aftermath have impacted your life?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for asking that. It is very coincidental that it is the mark of the 20-year mark. And I was in Washington, certainly very well aware of what was going on and the aftermath as well, both in the Arab world and also here. It's very interesting because I myself, after some very unpleasant episodes and very not very nice things that happened in those first few weeks after 9/11, when I had never really considered the fact, yeah, I'm Arab American, I'm sort of coming from someplace different. I never felt outsider, really. I knew that I didn't grow up here. I knew that I wasn't 100%, like we talked about, American, but I never had direct discrimination against me on that way, which did happen and happened to many of my friends and relatives. And, so meanwhile, as an Arab American, and the events of that day is you feel double sad. You feel so tragic on this situation, but you feel so sad what happened here, and the tragedy of what are going to be the effects, and we certainly know what they are, and wars that happened as a result in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think one of the things that I learned after 9/11, my instinct was to shut down and to pretend I was, Italian or Spanish or something, or Greek or something else that wasn't an Arab. And until I had a very intense conversation with a journalist friend of mine. And of course, she was in the same, sort of pod as me, being Lebanese American. And she said to me, Helen, now is the time that you should tell your story, that you should be you, that you should be more vocal, and don't hide your identity. And now is the time to go the other way, to expose, to say, this is my story. And as it turned out, this series, Stories My Father Told Me, which you're so graciously exhibiting in Greenbelt Gallery, there was more of a conscious effort, actually, I think. And when we put the stories beside the paintings, and of course, when people come to see, and in this country is completely made of immigrants, everyone could identify with these stories about family and village life and community and what is important and what's not. And that was an element of bringing together people as opposed to dividing them. And for me, that was a very important objective after 9/11, when I realized that I did have a vehicle to portray this side of Arabs, to say, wait a minute. So we're not terrorists. We're not all terrorists. Do not paint us with that brush. I paint these stories with another brush to show you, wait a minute, this is how we are, And the Arab American National Museum opened in 2005. Basically, I would say maybe if 9/11 hadn't happened, maybe it would have been slower to open up. But it was, again, to tell the world who we are in our own voice, not for anyone to say who we are, but for us rather to tell you who we are. We tell you who we are, and so I think the fact that you're having this exhibit now, the fact that we're being interviewed 2 days prior to the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is extremely poignant, and I'm thinking about it a lot. I'm thinking about it a lot, and hoping, like we do, that people have learned from the past. That's always something an artist wants to have happen for the future generations. Do we learn from the past? Do we not make the same mistakes? The exhibit that we have now, Stories My Father Told Me, is the antithesis. It's like, it's exactly the kind of thing we want to push back against negativity and stereotyping and judging and being judgmental. So
I appreciate your communicating a sense of urgency regarding the role of storytelling and art in culture in the aftermath of problems that didn't start in that realm, although culture has certainly contributed to stereotyping in really important ways. So it's great to see these positive examples of how art can serve to help us correct those problems.
Yeah, I think art, I wish I had a magic wand. I wish I could wipe away the world's problems and stop wars before they happen. But I am a humble artist, and I feel sometimes art can reach, whether it's music, whether it's poetry, whether it's the written word or dance or so on. I think there's a way that art can creep into people's souls to make them see things that words or politicians or lawyers or even presidents cannot express. I feel that artists have a way of communication that is somehow easier to absorb and maybe even more valuable than any sort of a rule that a politician can make and or a speech or something. It has a way of like creeping in underneath the surface. My work, I wouldn't say is political, but if you look at it in a way, you can say, well, she's talking about World War II, or she's talking about the Civil War, or she's talking about the Syrian War. But how am I talking about it? I'm talking about it in let's put it this way, a beautiful way, a way that the viewer can absorb. But after you look at my painting, then you could say, oh, okay, let me listen to her message, without me hitting you on the head of what I'm trying to say to you.
Oh, absolutely. In these pairings, it's very subtle in many cases. And that the pieces are so beautiful, and there's such dignity and composure in the subjects you portray, the people you portray, that it's, in some cases when I was reading the stories, it was surprising, to see about the depth and complexity, and in some cases, the harshness of the story behind the piece. And I was interested in that choice to foreground that peace and composure, even when the story is darker.
Yeah, I mean, if your viewers, and I hope they learn if they're not yet, are familiar with Jacob Lawrence's migration series, of the African American from the rural South to the urban North for many, many reasons, uh, uh, very harsh reasons. And, you know, what I love about that series and what I take away from that series after studying them quite a bit is that how he did portray his subjects with beauty, with dignity, as you said. You use that word dignity, which I'm very glad that you take that away from my stories, because it's a, you know, this is something that's very important in humankind, to be seen as dignified, to be seen to be possessing dignity. You know, you think of people leaving, you think of migration, you think of refugees. There's a weird connotation of being less than, you know, a refugee is less than human. The African Americans, us, me, people leaving are less than somebody not being put in that position. But, you know, in general, when people are forced to leave, including my own leaving of my home in Lebanon from the war at the age of 16, leaving everything behind, I assure you, I can guarantee that no one leaves home because they want to. No, it's not a holiday. You know, you're not just going like that. You are going because you have no choice, whether it's economic, whether it's a bombs dropping on you, whether it's not, you know, it's some sort of a you know, so whatever, a discrimination. But there's usually a poverty, there's drought, there's usually a reason behind it. You know, it's not to take lightly, to go someplace where you don't know the people, you don't know the culture, you don't know. I mean, my case was a bit different, but you were right. I came to America. I hadn't grown up here. Everything was new to me. You know, I was dropped in a completely new environment. You know, of course, I was an American citizen, as you noted, but still, so everything was different. So, anyways, it's so interesting, you know, that you use that word dignity, and I'm very glad that you picked up on that in my paintings and other work of mine, because I do try and imbue my work with that dignity.
Your father worked as a member of the United States Foreign Service. And as you mentioned, you grew up in the Middle East and Europe, where he was posted before moving to the United States in 1979 and attending college here. Elia was of a similar age when he first came to the US 33 years earlier, following the end of the Second World War. How have your experiences compared as newcomers integrating into American society?
This is the first time I've ever been asked that question, and it's interesting. It's made me think, because when I first came here, I didn't think about my dad. He was just my dad. I didn't think about his immigrant experiences, and he did immigrate here. I wasn't born here, but when I was born in America, he was a naturalized citizen, and my mom was American. But, you know, in doing this series, Stories My Father Told Me, I did think about how it must have been for him and my grandmother, Teta, and my aunt, coming here with really nothing and working 3 jobs to try and go to university. And he told me one time, much later, that he was crossing the street and there was a coin, like a nickel or something, which was a lot in those days, you know. But he was saying that there was a very attractive lady, this is a little bit of a divergent, but another student there who was walking, and the coin was there. And my father wanted to pick it up so badly, and 5 cents could mean a lot to him. And he felt so shy to pick it up. It would be a mark like on his neediness or poorness or something. So he passed the coin by in order not to appear a certain way in front of this American who probably didn't come from his circumstances. So he purposely walked by the nickel or the dime or whatever it may have been, a coin. And I remember thinking about that. I'm like, wow, that's so sad. You know, it was so, it made my heart a bit weak, you know, thinking about that. I mean, for me, coming here was a huge culture shock, a huge culture shock. I mean, even TV, and that was before internet, before this sort of cross-pollination that you have on social media and Instagram and all these things that we didn't have, that even now somebody in way far away is going to be able to know what is current in American culture in terms of, you know, TV and these other movies and these things that we mark as our, you know, if you want to say culture, what is trending in America. I can know, because even though I'm millions of miles away, I have the ability to see what you're watching on TV. Well, that wasn't the case when I was growing up. So when I entered as a freshman to university, plus being in the middle of the winter, which was super cold and super snowy, and Syracuse University, which I also wasn't used to, I got frostbite and everything. I really had to learn very quickly. Either I was to be quiet, actually, and to try and absorb, but a lot I didn't understand. A lot of cultural sort of behaviors I didn't understand. I grew up in a way that was quite sheltered, let's put it that way, partly because where I came from, and partly because I'm a girl, you know, that's a fact. And so, for instance, my older brother had much more freedom than I had. So my two younger sisters, when they came here, of course, they're younger than me, they grew to have more freedom, certainly, than I had at their age because of where I lived. In a way, I wish I asked my dad more about that. You know, my grandmother, she became a seamstress. She was a seamstress to work. I know my father was accepted to go to Harvard, but he couldn't afford the tuition. And Syracuse University afforded him, because he became an assistant teaching professor there, and to help pay. For me, that wasn't an issue. I didn't, my father, for us, education was the most important thing he could ever give us. So that was it. That was it. We were expected to do very well in our school and do as much best as we could do. And that was what was expected of us. You know, I feel lucky for that. I feel very lucky for that. I don't think somebody who, even, I don't think I ever feel like I fit in, ever. Even till now, after all these years later, I feel like I'm somewhere in between. I feel like one toe here and one toe there, you know, and I've grown to sort of like that place. It used to bother me. It used to really bother me that I didn't really completely fit in. And I now appreciate this sort of being in the middle, where I can kind of pick and choose, and I can see kind of both sides of things. And it's not a bad place to be. I'm more comfortable with that. I do try and bring the East and the West, if you will, together in my work, because I felt always this struggle, you know, this like a division between me, the East and the West, and trying bringing these pieces together. And wishing I was flatly in one or flatly in the other one. But, you know, the older I get, the more I'm growing, the more I hear people with similar stories. You know, it's okay. It's okay. I'm at peace with that sort of in-betweenness, you know.
It seems like it's been a very productive space for you. I know that you've served as a cultural envoy to several other countries. Does that relate to this middle position and your ability to make the connections?
100%, 100%. I love that question, and I feel very comfortable in that position because I feel like I can get both sides, and I can accentuate the one side. For instance, in the Arab world, when I'm there, on these missions, that because of COVID, a few of those trips were canceled. So hopefully they'll come back again. But I feel very comfortable in that role because, especially with women, but even with men, I can use my background as an Arab American to go to connect with them on a different level as somebody opposed to being completely have never been to the Middle East or not familiar with the language or the culture, regardless of what religion you are. So I feel that is really a good place for me, as you said, and I feel that I could be effective that way. And for the State Department, it's about changing hearts and minds. And the best way to do that is when someone can see themselves in you, and then also know that you also fit in with this American culture, and all Americans are not portrayed as this too. Just don't judge us and don't judge them as well. I mean, when I was serving in the West Bank, and I was with a group of women from the West Bank, from various villages in the West Bank, and I introduced themselves to me on the first day of our workshop. I introduced myself to them, and I said, I'm half and half. I told them in Arabic, I'm half and half, nus. And I said, I'm from Lebanon and America. And one of the women I was standing up and she was sitting down, and I felt she reached up and touched my arm and pulled my sleeve a bit, and she was shaking her finger at me. And then she said, no American, you're Lebanese. And so I said, okay, yeah, I'm Lebanese. I realized, at that moment, what they wanted, that was very important to them. Well, as the month went on, I was there for 1 month. At some point or another, towards the end of my working with these women, and we got to know each other every day, for a month, two or three of them came to me, and they started asking me personal questions like, was I married? Was my husband Lebanese? And when I was like, first I was going to say, yeah, he's Lebanese, because I thought they will never accept that I'm married to an American. But then I thought, no, I can't lie. I'm going to say, I said, no, Habibtis, which means my love. I said, Habibtis, my husband's is American. And I was waiting for this reaction. They look at me and they said, oh, what's his name? I said, Andy. And so the next thing, all these women are like, Andy, like they're pronouncing his name. So they looked at me and they said, yeah, Helen, next time you come visit us, you bring Andy with you. And I said, okay, thank you. And I thought, this is how it's supposed to be. They were skeptical. They didn't, now they see little by little by this one-to-one connection, which is exactly what, I think my position was supposed to be at that time, is to make those little inroads in this tiny human way. Once we see one another, once we get to know one another, it's very difficult to dislike or judge or stereotype that person. I am hoping that COVID will lessen and I'll be able to go back and do some of those incredible trips, because it makes me grow too, yeah.
I'm sure. So you've alluded to your wonderful work with the women, and also how expectations and opportunities may have been different for you as a girl. And I did want to just connect that back with the collection here, in that several of Elia's stories foreground the girls and women in his young life, including his mother, grandmother, and aunt and neighbors. And given the complexity of your personal experience, I'm curious as to how you feel about the long threads of women's history in your family lineage?
Mhm. Wow, that's really such a great question. And, you know, I'll tell you what, the first word that I think about when I think about that side of my family, and even my mom's American side of the family and the women, my aunts, my grandmother, my great grandmother, I think of the word strong. I I think of the word resilient and persevering. And in much of my work, I try and retain that beauty and strength and resilience and you know uh, persevering under conditions that I cannot imagine. Learning when my father actually wrote the stories and me reading them and thinking about them as I tried to paint them, I thought so much about how I wish I had known my great grandmother, who must have been so strong and pushing through and not feeling sorry and not feeling victim and just going through the harshness of life, whether or not they were exiled, whether or not the conditions they suffered through the pandemic, the flu pandemic, starvation. One of the big reasons they in Lebanon and Syria, they were starving. My father, as a young man, World War II, as a young man, was asked by the British and the Australians, because he could speak Arabic and English fluently, to be a translator. Like we're talking about these Afghani translators here, the locals helping the troops. Well, the same, Daddy did the same. Now I'm thinking about it now as I'm talking to you, but he did the same with the British and the Australian in World War II. And one of the things, he would go out on missions with them and so on, to some extent, his peril too, as well. I mean, that wasn't very, there were dangerous conditions on him. But, you know, he learned Australian songs, which he would sing to me later on. I had no idea what those songs were, but from the soldiers. And then they would give him food. They would give him food. They got fresh fruit. And he would go and give that to his family, like oranges, like a thing we taking for granted. You know, we're taking for granted. Thinking about strength, thinking about my grandmother, Teta, who picked up her family and moved from one village to the next village, you know, trying to whether education or move to better living circumstances for her children, my dad and my two aunts, and ultimately immigrating here, was massively impressive to me, and thinking about the strength of women. So rather than thinking of them as being put down or oppressed, I don't think of that way of the women in my family. I know there are a lot of issues, and that's another stereotype. But of course there are many inequities, yes, till today. And yes, I was restricted. There were things that I couldn't do, which I got mad at. I couldn't do certain things that my brother could do. I felt it was very unfair. He could go places. I always had to have a chaperone. I couldn't walk by myself. I had to be also with my brother, with my father. I was, you know, this is really silly. You know, here I am, known as an artist now and making my way in this world as an artist, and that's my legacy. But, you know, I actually wanted to be a singer, unbelievably. And I was refused. There's no way, no way. My father felt that that was not appropriate for his daughter to be a singer. And that was it. I couldn't study singing in university, but I could study art. And I loved both, but that path was not open to me. They would not support it. And so, you know, that's not a huge deal. It's not really a huge deal. I'm very glad in a way that this is how my path, it feels good to me. I'm proud of what I do, I'm grateful for my parents for giving me this chance to pursue to be an artist. And they support me. They supported me in everything very, very well, both of them. In my path, they're very, very proud of what I do and what my voice has become. Not my singing voice, but my art voice, you know. Yeah. And my brother wanted to be a guitarist, but forget that. He had to be a lawyer. So in a way, he couldn't do what he wanted to do too.
You've expressed that you hope through your work to encourage dialogue and bring understanding and acceptance between the people of the Arab world and the West. You've written, my work is ultimately about creating empathy, creating a shared space for introspection and dialogue. I ask the viewer, you say, to see through someone else's eyes, to walk in another's shoes, to accept the other. While much of this work occurs in the hearts and minds of your viewers, as you say, can you share any other experiences with us in which you've seen the impact of your work manifested tangibly?
Wow. Over the course of one summer a few years ago, I've been painting little children's shoes. The reason I was painting these little children's shoes where I was thinking in the height of the movement and the displacement and the exodus of Syrian people, 13 million of them in such a short span of time, fleeing for safety from the war. I was thinking, who are the most vulnerable in general? Are the women and children. And, you know, thinking of those children crossing borders, walking through mud and rain and snow and the most inhospitable terrain and ending up in a refugee camp with open sewage. And I was thinking about their shoes. And so I began painting these shoes, and I called that installation, "Oh, the Places They'll Go." And I am taking off on that Dr. Seuss work that many, many people are familiar with. "Oh, the Places You'll Go," which is read at graduations, which is read to people in front saying, you have your full dreams ahead of you. You're living here in this country where these dreams are a possibility. There is no reason not to dream about what can be in your future, is the way that I take that book. And looking at that book towards these children who, at no fault of their own, is having a whole other future, or maybe lack of future ahead of them. Can they pursue their dreams? Can you have those dreams in a refugee camp? Can you have those dreams being born in a refugee camp? Those shoes were part of an installation at the Woodrow Wilson Museum up in DuPont Circle, where the house of Woodrow Wilson, after he left the presidency, after he left the White House, he and his wife moved in. And the curator at the time, incredible curator, Asantua, she took my shoe installation and she reinstalled it. I said, you do whatever you want to do. She reinstalled it on a rug that had been given to President Wilson by the president or the head of state from France as a gift to the Americans. And he had that in his library where he sat with all his books and his globe and his cane, and you could see his glasses and so on and so forth. And she reconfigured the series of 24 painted shoes on the rug in front of Woodrow Wilson's chair, his reclining chair. And when I came to see what she did prior to the opening of our exhibit, she said, "Helen, the first pair of shoes that I took out were these tiny little shoes, little baby shoes, toddler shoes that I had painted." And she said, I started to cry. She's American. She started to cry. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "They're the same size shoes as my little Zoe is wearing now." And all of a sudden, I just put my little girl in those shoes and thinking about what those little kids are in Syria or where else. They're not the only refugees. I mean, there's issues all over this world. There's Somalia, everywhere, you can say. And she started to cry. And if that was not it's making me emotional thinking about it, but it was so visceral, if you will. When I say put yourself in someone's shoes, I'm meaning it in a way. Be in that moment. Try and think about how it is. I'm not saying people here have it easy too. I'm not saying that. There are degrees, you know, but as somebody who is talking about the side that I feel comfortable to talk about in my most authentic voice, and what I want exchange on both sides, I really hope, I pray that I'm trying to achieve that in my work. I hope that is what I can be known for, whether or not it's doing a cultural exchange program, whether or not it's stories my father told me in Greenbelt Gallery with you and people who would have never known what happens in a Syrian village, you know? I mean, how cool is that? That somehow from across the world and across time, as you say, it's connecting with who knows who's going to pass by and see that and want to know about their own stories and their own strong women and their own identity and what they should feel proud of, regardless of who they are or where they came from.
The rest of the quotation from you that I had cited earlier states that your goals include to reject divisiveness, to promote acceptance and understanding, and to reject violence and subjugation of anyone, anywhere, to give voice to the voiceless, to heal, to reflect in our shared humanity. Helen Zughaib, thank you for your work, and thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such an honor to speak with you. Your questions were so thoughtful, and I know we could have spoken for millions of years more. Thank you to the audience who's going to view. I am so grateful, and I'm truly, truly humbled. And I'm going to try not to cry, but I feel very emotional talking about a lot of this. Thank you. Thank you so, so much. This has been such an honor. Thank you.